Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chazla Jadolo.
Tonight, New York on the front line of the battle against COVID-19 as the US sets a new record for the number of deaths.
It seems America won't be resurrected for Easter, but is the lockdown flattening the curve?
We'll look at one of the worst places to be in this pandemic, New York's prison on Rikers Island.
And insanity's not a known side effect of coronavirus, but the isolation seems to be getting to some people.
Coronavirus! Coronavirus!
Wash your hands, you little
I know how they feel. A week ago, President Trump was saying that he wanted America open again by Easter. This week, his top health advisors gave him a very stark warning about the number of deaths that could see in the United States.
Anywhere between 1.6 and 2.2 million fatalities if we didn't mitigate.
And that certainly seems to have caught the president's attention.
When I heard the number today, first time I've heard that number, because I've been asking the same question that some people have been asking, I felt even better about what we did last week with the $2.2 trillion, because you're talking about a potential of up to 2.2 million, and some people said it could even be higher than that. So you're talking about 2.2 million deaths.
But it was hardly new news. That number was contained in a widely reported study released 2 weeks ago from Imperial College London researcher Neil Ferguson. And that number, 2.2 million, doesn't even take into account the negative effects on health systems being overwhelmed, which they clearly already are. So, instead of full pews on Easter Sunday, the social distancing and stay-at-home orders have now been extended by the president through to the end of April and probably at least until June. Still, the president says that he does not regret pushing the idea of reopening things sooner than that.
No, that was aspirational. We had an aspiration.
It's fair to say we're all on a bit of a learning curve, including the president, and it's probably a good thing that he didn't listen to some of the other advice he's been getting.
I mean, we had a lot of people were saying maybe we shouldn't do anything, just ride it. They say ride it like a cowboy. Just ride it, ride that sucker right through. That's where the 2.2 million people come in.
Yee-haw. Meanwhile, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infection, Dr. Anthony Fauci, says he doesn't like to put a number on the likely American death toll, even with social distancing and other lockdown measures. But this week, he did.
I would say between 100 and 200,000 cases, but I don't want to be held to that.
Now, that's sounding pretty realistic from where America is right now, but of course it didn't have to be that way. People like to focus on the 2 million deaths figure in that Imperial College model you mentioned, but remember, the report explicitly said that was assuming the unlikely absence of any control measures or spontaneous changes in individual behaviour. Obviously, the government was going to do something during years of viral carnage, but by contrast, that same model actually predicted quite low numbers of deaths if governments responded quickly. Just this week, the person who led that model, Niall Ferguson, testified to the British Parliament that he now expected less than 20,000 COVID deaths in the UK, not 500,000, which would translate to about 80,000 deaths in America if the government doesn't do anything stupid. But as John pointed out, Trump took an interest in that 2 million figure because it allows him to move the goalposts.
2.2 million deaths, 2.2 million people from this. And so if we could hold that down, as we're saying, to 100,000, it's a horrible number. Maybe even less, but to 100,000. So we have between 100 and 200,000. We all together have done a very good job.
Remember when the goalposts of a good job were this?
When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
And that's how Trump uses the media sensationalism back against the media. But let's look at the actual numbers. America is now approaching 190,000 COVID cases, with 24,000 more just yesterday. And those numbers are well ahead of the next most affected countries. As for deaths, America has now suffered around 3,900 of them, with a new high of over 700 more deaths just yesterday. And that's pushed America's total deaths past China's death numbers. That is, if you believe China's numbers, which you may not. Boris Johnson's scientific advisors apparently believe that China's official stats could be downplayed by a factor of 15 to 40 times. And a number of people have noted that it's strange that Wuhan, a place where before the crisis crematoriums typically cremated about 220 people a day, are suddenly seeing 7 funeral homes handing out the cremated remains of about 500 people each every day for a week. And that implies a lot more than the 2,500 COVID deaths that China claims took place in Wuhan. Although the gold medal for unlikely claims would have to go to Russia, who claims to have only had 2,500 cases of COVID-19 so far. But in St. Petersburg last week, they supposedly recorded 63,000 cases of SARS, which is an illness that no one else seems to have caught since 2004. Talking about dodgy numbers, Trump has referred a few times recently to Obama's swine flu numbers, like saying that swine flu was a catastrophe that cost 17,000 lives. Now, firstly, the number is 12,500, not 17,000, but also that 12,500 number is not like the lab-confirmed numbers that we're seeing every day. That's what a scientific estimate said after the fact. So to compare apples with apples, to compare the daily numbers we're now getting with the daily numbers we got with swine flu, on day 70 of the swine flu epidemic, there were 127 confirmed deaths compared to the 3,900 deaths I just told you about before from COVID-19. But if we break those deaths down by state, you can see that while a number of deaths are accruing in New Jersey, Michigan and Louisiana, the lion's share have occurred in New York. It's been hit really hard. Last Wednesday saw 6,400 medical 911 calls being made, breaking the record set on 9/11. On Friday, we showed you the massive refrigerator trucks in which hospitals are storing excess bodies. Well, New York has bought 45 of them. Now, it's not all bad. The hospital ship, the USNS Comfort, has finally arrived in New York, taking a little pressure off hospitals, but the fact remains that these hospitals are heavily under pressure, not just from old COVID patients, but young ones as well. Those are New York COVID deaths, by the way, you're looking at. And the biggest source of pressure seems to be that once patients get on ventilators, they don't really get off them. As Andrew Cuomo put it,
most people are on a ventilator for 2, 3, 4 days. These COVID patients can come in and need a ventilator for up to 20 days.
So with 8,000 more COVID cases a day, it's crunch time in New York.
Yeah, it certainly is. Let's find out what it's really like, because when a health system like New York's has a sudden influx of COVID-19 patients, that puts a huge strain on all of the other things that doctors and nurses and hospitals do every day. And when the beds and equipment run out, you end up with more people dying from any number of other things as well. Dr. Diane Hess is with us now. She specialises in paediatrics and obesity. Dr. Hess, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
Doctor, how close are New York's hospitals right now to being overwhelmed by demand for intensive care beds?
They are. They're completely overwhelmed. I mean, Central Park has tents now for COVID patients. There is standing room only in our ER to be seen for adults. We have no more pediatric emergency room. Our pediatric emergency room has become a hallway, and we have 2 separate rooms for babies under 2 months old with fever that has separate air actually coming in. So it's not even mixed with the regular emergency room. We have turned ORs into ICUs. Doctors who, surgeons, ENTs, doctors who have some training in intubation but might not have been doing that every day, are now doing intubations.
And how is this affecting doctors emotionally? There was a study from China which showed 71% of doctors over there were experiencing psychological distress and 50% were depressed because of COVID.
Oh, it's awful. I mean, the sheer lack of protective gear. I paid for my staff, the N95 masks usually cost $1 a mask, and I paid $11.80 per mask to get them from Mexico. I got 100 today. I mean, it's just price gouging. People are afraid to go to work. We have doctors who are just so overworked emotionally, mentally. We can't remember. We're New Yorkers. We don't own cars, so we take public transportation everywhere. But now people are afraid to take their subway. How do you get to work? Who can afford an Uber? Doctors are being asked to volunteer, whereas nurses are getting paid. So I don't know how many doctors want to volunteer in an emergency room. It's very frightening for people, and you're made to feel very guilty if you don't do it. It's really, they're terrible. It's terrible times.
Now, people assume that COVID is just for old people, but the stats suggest that plenty of young people get very sick from it as well. From what you've seen, what's the difference in the experience that old people have when they get sick from COVID compared to young people?
Well, I'm not an adult medicine doctor, but from what I hear from the hospitals, we definitely have more 30 and 40-year-olds than we expected who are getting very sick, but they are also the ones who are recovering. Yes, you're going to hear the anecdote of the 30-year-old nurse or the 40-year-old nurse, but it's really, we lost a treasure in New York. Dr. Goodrich, he's a very famous, world famous neurosurgeon who separated, conjoined twins by the head. He's one of the most revered neurosurgeons in the world. He passed away today, 72, from COVID. I mean, I don't know that he was sick. He looked pretty healthy to all of us who worked with him, but he was 72. So age is really a deciding factor in this. My best friend lost her dad this week. I have another friend whose dad is in the hospital. My other friend's mom is positive. So it is definitely, predominantly infecting the elderly, but we do see younger people. And I'm very interested to know, and we'll only know this after, because they all say these young people had no predisposing illnesses. But I wonder if some of the young people were vaping, the juuling, because that's been a huge epidemic here, and it really does damage the lungs. But we won't know that until much, much later.
And Doctor, why is it, do you think, that New York has been so hard hit at this stage? Is it just down to population density, or are there other factors at play here?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely population density. Apartment crowding. I live in an apartment with 365 apartments. We know that there's 2 COVID positives already in my building, but there could be a lot more. That you're not obligated to tell your landlord that you're COVID positive. People live in crowded housing, and because less people are going to work, they've cut the subway and busing to Saturday and Sunday, like holiday hours. So the few buses and subways that do come are packed. So you're doing the exact opposite of what you wanted. You wanted social distancing, but people are getting on a packed subway. So, I forbid my children from taking the subway. We know it's faster. We know we can get to places, but if they had to get somewhere, I'm driving them. I'm not letting them take the subway.
Dr. Hess, the vulnerability of New York's prison population is an issue that we've been looking at this week on the show. Are there any other areas of particular vulnerability, though, that you think we should be looking out for?
Well, the homeless. It's a huge problem. My daughter's 13, so she walked to my office this afternoon to just get a change of scenery, and she did her homework. They have online school, and she did it at my desk. And she said, "Mom, I don't want to walk again to your office." And we live in a very nice neighborhood in Chelsea, and we walk all over. And she said it's the zombie apocalypse. There are so many homeless people now who have, who got kicked out of psychiatric hospitals when they closed, and they've been living on the streets and in shelters. But now, because of the coronavirus, they don't want to stay in the shelters, so they're all over the streets. And we walked home, and our walk home is 20 minutes. And I'm literally not exaggerating that every other street we had to cross the street because there was a deranged homeless person throwing something, screaming, urinating on a wall, hunched up in a corner doing drugs, in a telephone booth doing drugs. It's like the zombie apocalypse. I can't let my kids walk the dogs, and we live in a very nice neighborhood. It's crazy.
Dr. Diane Hess, many thanks indeed for joining us this week.
Okay, thank you.
Being stuck at home during the coronavirus shutdown isn't a whole lot of fun. Even with the TV, a lifetime supply of toilet paper and a fully stocked fridge, not being able to leave the house for days and weeks on end can feel a bit like you're in prison. So spare a thought for those who literally are in prison. Not only can't they leave, but social distancing is all but impossible. New York City is now the epicentre of the coronavirus pandemic, and there are growing fears of a humanitarian disaster brewing in the city's main prison complex at Rikers Island. Over the weekend, more than 100 New York prison inmates and 80 correctional staff tested positive for COVID-19, but officials won't say how many it's actually tested. Rikers Island already has 10 times the infection rate of wider New York, almost 3% now, and experts say it will be 100% within weeks. There are 10 jails on the island. It's built on a toxic landfill in the East River just off LaGuardia Airport. It's usually home to around 10,000 inmates at any given time, including Harvey Weinstein, who contracted coronavirus at Rikers last week and was transferred to another jail. But Rikers inmates aren't all rapists. In fact, 85% haven't been convicted of anything. They're waiting for their trial, and in a lot of cases, they'd be free on bail but they just can't afford the bond. City and state officials are now sending some older prisoners home.
Mayor Bill de Blasio says the city is working to identify which inmates are eligible for release due to health conditions or because their charges were minor.
Currently, around 2,000 Rikers prisoners have been identified for possible release, including over 50s, the infirm, non-violent, low-level offenders or people in jail for parole violations. 2 weeks ago, a civilian investigator for the Department of Corrections on Rikers became the first city worker to die after contracting coronavirus. And this isn't just a New York problem, of course. There are a lot of Americans in jail right now, around 2.3 million. If prison was a city, it would be equal fourth biggest in America alongside Houston, Texas.
Once any kind of disease or infection gets into these spaces with an already aging population, folks who are already coming from marginalized communities, what we're looking at, quite frankly, could be a nightmare.
As the pandemic spreads, there will be plenty of tough choices for prison authorities to make, and if they're too slow to act or if prisoners are considered just too dangerous for temporary release, it could be literally a death sentence for thousands, Chaz.
Yeah, and there's a dark irony in all this, John. At least some New York prisons don't offer hand sanitizer or cleaning supplies, but it's prisoners who are helping produce New York's own brand of hand sanitizer for wages as low as 16 cents an hour. Having said all that, Attorney General Bill Barr is awake to the issue of prisoners in a pandemic, and he's put out a direction noting that there are some at-risk inmates who are non-violent, little chance of reoffending, and they might be safer serving their sentences at home instead. Now, there are some concerns that the algorithm that Barr's using to determine who should be released deems white-collar offenders as generally safe to be released, but not so much drug addicts with a history of prior arrests. And so, therefore, only 7% of black male prisoners would qualify to be sent home, whereas 30% of white male prisoners would qualify for release. But obviously every person who gets out creates more space in the prison, and so that's safer for everybody.
And now, live from Planet America, it's the inaugural Celebrities Going Insane in Quarantine Awards!
That's the thing about COVID-19, it doesn't care about how rich you are, how famous you are, how funny you are, how smart you are.
Well, yesterday I did something really useful. I laundered all my sneakers.
In a champagne supernova in the sky, wash your hands, you little f***ers.
So easy to not have
Guess what, bitch? Coronavirus! Coronavirus! I'm telling you, shit is real! Shit is getting real! Woo!
I just can't figure the guy. It's like, I don't know, it's like watching a yo-yo. I shouldn't have said it that way. It's like watching...
It feels that way. I want to ask... It's okay.
After initially downplaying the threat posed by the coronavirus, in recent weeks, President Trump has proclaimed himself to be
a wartime president. This is a war.
And 2 weeks ago, he activated the Defence Production Act, which gives the federal government sweeping wartime powers to tell industry exactly what it needs and allows them to set the prices. President Trump initially resisted doing that, though, but history shows when American industry is mobilised, it can be a very potent fighting force. Barely a month after America was dragged into the Second World War following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt announced a seemingly ambitious set of production goals.
First, to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes.
FDR also announced America would produce 45,000 tanks.
And similar figures for a multitude of other implements of war will give the Japanese and the Nazis a little idea of just what they accomplished in the attack at Pearl Harbor.
Roosevelt's War Production Board had broad powers and American manufacturers fell into line, albeit reluctantly at first. In 1941, 3 million cars rolled off American production lines over the next 4 years of war. Just 139 new cars would be built. Instead, Chrysler specialised in aircraft bodies. General Motors and Packard built the engines, guns, trucks and tanks. The Ford Motor Company churned out complete B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. Lipstick makers converted their machines to produce bullet casings. 16 million American GIs went to war, while 24 million went to work on the war effort, including 8 million women.
In war towns all over the United States, women are called upon to leave their homes and take jobs. Among our young unmarried women and among older women whose children are grown, we have a large reserve. They discover that factory work is usually no more difficult than housework. Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men, some jobs better.
It was total mobilisation of industry and what they still called manpower for total war. Manufacturing output tripled, wages went up, spending increased. The US economy boomed for the first time since the 1920s. 2/3 of all the equipment used by all Allied forces in the Second World War, including Australia, came from an American factory. The government's war powers ended with the arrival of peace in 1945, and American factories went back to making cars, washing machines and lipstick. But by 1950, a new kind of war was developing, a Cold War with the Soviet Union that erupted into armed conflict in Korea. Like Pearl Harbor, the invasion of South Korea had caught America by surprise.
Equipped with top-notch weapons, armor, and artillery, these crack Marine units will help plug the gap in U.S. fighting strength in Korea.
In September 1950, the Truman administration passed the Defence Production Act, which remains in place to this day. It didn't go as far as Roosevelt's war powers, but still allowed Truman to compel manufacturers to prioritise defence production. And not just things like tanks and planes. In recent years, the act has been used to help restore power to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and even promote the development of biofuels. In the face of the coronavirus pandemic, President Trump has remained cautious, hoping industry would rise to the occasion. But as negotiations with General Motors over ventilators stalled on the weekend, the president started issuing orders via Twitter.
They said they were going to give us 40,000 much-needed ventilators very quickly. Now they're saying it will only be 6,000 in late April, and they want top dollar. Start making ventilators now.
Not exactly what Harry Truman had in mind, perhaps, but the DPA is now in effect.
It sure is. The same day that Trump invoked the DPA, GM announced it would use a retooled factory to deliver its first ventilators in April and would soon be ramping up to produce 10,000 ventilators per month. So that is good news. As was the Service Employees International Union, somehow digging up 39 million N95 masks. That's quite an addict that they have. And they also apparently have found a supplier that can produce 20 million more masks per week. Of course, supplies will still be an issue for a while yet, which is why this claim from Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was so disturbing.
You know, when the federal government told us that we needed to go it ourselves, we started procuring every item we could get our hands on. But what I've gotten back is that vendors with whom we had contracts are now being told not to send stuff here to Michigan.
Okay, if Trump is actively sabotaging governors that he dislikes, then we've got a problem. But is he? On CNN the same afternoon, Whitmer said, as we are getting closer to the date when shipments are supposed to come in, they're getting cancelled or they're getting delayed. We've been told they're going first to the federal government, which is a much less worrying claim. And FEMA have said that no vendor shipments were being diverted from Michigan. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but I do know that a poll of 213 mayors in 41 states found about 90% of the mayors said they lacked sufficient test kits, face masks and other protective equipment. They also know that Massachusetts received 17% of what they asked for from the federal government, Maine received 5% of what they asked for, and Colorado received enough supplies for one whole day. Whoopee! But leaning red swing state Florida received absolutely everything they asked for, just 3 days after they requested it. And then they received an identical shipment about a week later. And they're now awaiting a third shipment. So we'll see exactly how Trump puts those DPA powers of his to good use, John.
Yeah, we shall indeed. On Friday night's Fireside Chat, should Bernie drop out of the presidential race?
Nope.
We'll be talking to one of the leading lights of the American left, Ben Jealous. He's a Bernie backer from way back, a former head of the NAACP. Lots to talk to him about. Tune in at the slightly later time of 8:15 p.m. Eastern on Friday night.
Now, we saw this week part of the reason why Democrats are so keen on Joe Biden. In the latest Fox News poll, Trump had one of his highest approval ratings ever, and yet Biden was still beating him by 9 points. But then there's the downside of Joe Biden, like allegations of sexual assault. Let's go back to last year, when the world was having a good laugh about creepy Uncle Joe's penchant for sniffing hair. Back then, one of his accusers, a woman named Tara Reid, wasn't talking about hair sniffing. She was talking about unwanted and uncomfortable touching from Biden. Now, most people didn't really register her complaint, but some people apparently did, because Reid said there was an immediate, brutal, fallout attack on her, and she received threats on her life via phone and email. Now, Reid said that made her too scared to reveal her more serious accusations at the time, but when she wrote about her general experience later, she did hint, "I have not told the whole story of what occurred between Joe Biden and myself," which certainly attracted the attention of some Bernie Sanders supporting journalists. They began to work on her, and this week Reid finally told her story. She was a Senate aide working for Biden in 1993 when she was asked to give him a gym bag in a quiet hallway.
And then when I gave him the gym bag, it happened all in one motion almost. And he had me against the wall, and then his hands were down my skirt and up my skirt, and I was wearing I wasn't wearing tights or anything, and he then with his hand went from there and entered me with his hand, and as he was trying to kiss me and saying things to me. And then when he did that, I was obviously pulling away, and he pulled back and said, "Come on, man, I heard you liked me," something to that effect. And that's what kind of jolted me. Like, I was trying to think what I did wrong to bring that on me. And then he looked angry and irritated with me, and he said to me when he pulled back, he pointed his finger at me and he said, "You're nothing to me. You're nothing." And then he straightened his clothes and he went away.
Now, as soon as that interview came out, people were revisiting a post that Reid once wrote in which she said, "I love Russia with all my heart, and President Putin scares the power elite in America because he's a compassionate, caring, visionary leader. And what if I told you everything you learned about Russia was wrong? What if I told you as an American citizen we've been fed propaganda to further a certain political American agenda? What if I told you actually we are the bad guys?" Now, that might not seem like such a big deal to you, but she wrote that piece in December 2018. And then she also posted it in Russian. Okay, that's getting a bit weird. But if Russia had something to do with these allegations, they were playing a mighty long game, because Reid told her mother, her brother and her friend about the incident back in 1993. And while her mother is dead, both Reid's friend and brother have recalled to The Intercept hearing about Reid's story back in 1993. But her brother admits he told her just to move on at the time. Now, that is more evidence than we often hear in these old cases. But some have pointed out that Reid initially supported Elizabeth Warren for president and now supports Bernie Sanders. Sure, but I'm not sure why it would be surprising that Reid isn't supporting the guy that she says sexually assaulted her. Then there's Biden's campaign's response. They've put out a statement. Women have a right to tell their story, and reporters have an obligation to rigorously vet those claims. We encourage them to do so because these accusations are false. They also released a statement from Biden's executive assistant from the 80s and 90s, Marianne Baker, who says, "I never once witnessed or heard of or received any reports of inappropriate conduct, period. Not from Miss Reid, not from anyone." Which is interesting, because Reid says she filed an official complaint about Biden's sexual harassment back in 1993. So there may be evidence somewhere that somebody isn't telling the truth. In the meantime, it comes down to who you believe. Just remember though, for a woman to come forward in the glaring lights of focus, you've got to start off with a presumption that at least the essence of what she's talking about is real. And that was, of course, said by Joe Biden during the Brett Kavanaugh judicial hearings. Biden is going to have to step very carefully on this one, John. Very carefully indeed.
Yes. And that is all the time we have for Planet America for this week. We'll see you back here next Wednesday, right after You Can't Ask Dad.
And don't forget our Fireside Chat on Friday on ABC News at 8:15 p.m. Eastern.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.